The elderly man moved carefully through the forest, his breath visible in the cold air. His fingers trembled as he reached for the rusted trap, its sharp teeth glinting under the fading sun. But he wasn't alone. Something watched from the shadows. The forest had changed. Time had reshaped it, sculpting the trees into gnarled sentinels, their roots sprawling like fingers, searching for something lost beneath the damp earth. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decaying leaves, carrying the whispers of things long forgotten. And yet, for Elias Carter, it was still the same place. His boots pressed into the soft, moss-covered ground as he moved forward, his breath steady but heavy with the weight of the years. The familiar ache in his bones no longer surprised him, nor did the loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. Elias had spent most of his life in these woods, his hands once strong enough to carve paths through the wilderness, to build, to shape, to command. Now they shook, not from fear, but from time itself. He adjusted the old satchel slung across his shoulder, its leather worn and cracked with age. Inside, a few simple tools rattled: a pocket knife, a tin of biscuits, a flask of coffee that had gone cold long before he'd taken his first sip. But there was one object that never made a sound, though it carried the most weight. A faded photograph, edges curled from years of handling, rested in the inner pocket of his coat. It was of a woman with a smile like warm summer rain, his wife, Margaret. Gone, like the echoes of his youth. Elias exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing against the photograph as if the touch alone could bring back the warmth of her presence. But there was no bringing back the past. That's why he was here, to make peace, to find purpose in the silence she left behind. The trap lay ahead, half buried beneath damp leaves, its rusted teeth still sharp enough to maim. He had seen too many creatures fall victim to these cruel devices, helpless, suffering, abandoned to the slow decay of pain. Once, years ago, he might not have given it much thought, but age had a way of softening even the hardest hearts. And Margaret, she had always been the voice of kindness, the whisper in his ear that made him pause, reconsider, choose mercy. He knelt carefully, the cold earth biting through his jeans. His fingers wrapped around the metal, feeling its resistance, its refusal to let go. With a slow breath, he pried it open, his grip sure despite the tremor in his hands. The trap released with a reluctant sigh, its cruel bite undone. For a moment, Elias simply stared at it. The rust, the history of it, the things it had taken. Then, the underbrush rustled. A sound, not the wind, not the shifting of leaves. Something alive. Elias lifted his gaze, and from the thick tangle of trees, two golden eyes met his own. The German shepherd emerged slowly, its body tense, cautious, moving like a shadow carved from the forest itself. Its coat was dark, streaked with mud, its ribs faintly visible beneath the thick fur. Elias knew the look of a stray, a survivor. But this wasn't just any dog. This was a working dog, a K9. The animal's ears flicked, assessing him, its breath visible in the cold morning air. It took another step forward, and Elias saw it then, the raw red line around its neck where a collar had once been. A service dog, abandoned, lost. His heart tightened. The dog's gaze flicked to the trap, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the disturbed earth. It understood. Elias could see it in the way its body relaxed ever so slightly. "That's right, boy," Elias muttered, his voice rough from years of silence. "Not today." The shepherd's ears twitched at the sound, its tail lowering, not in fear, but in understanding. Elias had never been one for superstition, but there was something about the way the dog looked at him that sent a chill down his spine. Then the shepherd took another step, slow and deliberate, closer. Elias remained still, letting the animal decide. He had learned, long ago, that trust wasn't something to be forced. And then, in a movement so unexpected that Elias barely had time to react, the dog lowered itself to the ground, resting its head on its paws. a gesture of surrender, of acceptance. Something deep within Elias shifted. Margaret had always believed in second chances. Maybe that belief hadn't died with her after all. He reached out, slow and steady, his fingers brushing against the dog's fur. The shepherd didn't flinch, didn't pull away. "Guess we both got a little lost, huh?" Elias murmured. The wind sighed through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something Elias hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The morning air was crisp, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Elias sat on the old log near the trap, the German shepherd watching him with steady, intelligent eyes. The forest was quiet, save for the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. He hadn't expected company out here, certainly not in the form of a K9 dog. The shepherd's ribs were slightly visible beneath its dark coat. It was well trained. He could tell from the way it moved, the way it held itself, but something about it felt lost, like it had nowhere to go. Elias understood that feeling all too well. "Where'd you come from, boy?" he muttered, reaching into his satchel. The dog didn't answer, of course, but it didn't run either. That was something. Elias pulled out a biscuit, dry and crumbly, not much, but better than nothing. He held it out, resting it on his palm. The shepherd sniffed the air, then, after a moment's hesitation, stepped forward. Its movements were slow, measured, as if it wasn't sure whether to trust him yet. "Go on," Elias encouraged. "It ain't poisoned." The dog took the biscuit carefully, almost delicately, chewing with slow, deliberate motions. Hunger, but not desperation. It had been fed before, trained, disciplined. This wasn't a stray. This was a soldier without a unit. Elias leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. "Someone left you behind, didn't they?" The shepherd's ears twitched, but it didn't break eye contact. He'd seen working dogs before, on the news, in passing. They were trained for war, for rescue, for companionship that ran deeper than simple obedience. They were partners, not pets. If this one had been abandoned, someone had committed a terrible wrong. And yet, the dog was here, watching him, following him. Elias sighed, standing up slowly. The dog's head lifted, ears alert, waiting for his next move. "Well," he said, adjusting his satchel, "come or don't." "Your choice." He turned and started walking. The forest stretched ahead of him, the trail winding between towering pines. He didn't look back, didn't call out. If the dog followed, it followed. If not, well, Elias had learned long ago not to expect much from anyone. But then, after a few quiet steps, he heard it, soft footfalls padding behind him. A shadow at his side. The shepherd had made its choice. The cabin wasn't much, just a small structure nestled between the trees, its wooden walls worn from years of wind and rain. It had been his and Margaret's refuge, back when they needed to escape the noise of the world. Now, it was just a quiet place for a man with too many ghosts. Elias opened the door with a slow creak, stepping inside. The air smelled of old wood, faded memories, and the lingering scent of coffee that had long since gone stale. He set his satchel on the table, then turned to find the shepherd standing at the threshold, hesitant. "Well?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "You coming in or not?" The dog hesitated only a moment longer before stepping inside. It sniffed the air, then moved cautiously, inspecting the small space. Elias watched as it circled the room, its gaze sharp, assessing every corner like it was trained to do. "Still on duty, huh?" he muttered, shaking his head. "Guess that doesn't go away." The shepherd settled near the fireplace, its body relaxing but its ears still twitching at every sound. It was alert, but not afraid. Elias poured himself a cup of coffee from an old thermos, then leaned against the counter, watching the dog. "You got a name?" he asked. No response. He sighed. "Guess I'll have to figure that one out myself." Names had meaning. They carried weight. Elias had never been one to give them lightly. He studied the dog, the way it moved, the way it watched him, patient and unyielding. This wasn't just any animal. It had history, purpose, a past it wasn't ready to share. Elias sipped his coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest. "All right then," he said finally, setting the cup down. "How's Shadow sound?" The dog's ears flicked, a quiet acknowledgement. Elias smirked. "Yeah, thought so." As the day stretched on, Shadow remained close, moving when Elias moved, watching as he tended to the small chores around the cabin. It felt strange, having a presence here again. For years, this place had been silent, empty. Now, there was the sound of breathing that wasn't his own, the occasional shuffle of paws on wooden floors. It should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt right. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light through the trees. Elias sat on the porch, whittling away at a piece of wood with his pocket knife. Shadow lay beside him, his head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded but still alert. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply existed in the quiet, in the understanding that neither had asked for this, but neither seemed willing to change it. Then, somewhere in the distance, a sound shattered the peace. A gunshot. Elias froze. Shadow's head snapped up, ears rigid. Another shot rang out, then silence. Elias's grip tightened on the knife. He hadn't heard gunfire out here in years, not since hunters had been banned from these woods. His jaw clenched. He stood slowly, slipping the knife into his pocket. Shadow was already on his feet, muscles tense, eyes locked in the direction of the sound. Elias exhaled, glancing at the dog. "Well, guess we're about to find out what kind of trouble's waiting for us, huh?" Shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Elias saw it in his stance, in the unwavering focus in his golden eyes. The dog was ready, so was he. The silence that followed the gunshot was heavier than the twilight settling over the forest. Elias didn't move, didn't breathe, his senses attuned to the stillness. Shadow stood beside him, muscles tight, ears flicking toward every unseen sound. The dog's body was coiled with tension, waiting for the next move. Elias had lived long enough to know that silence after gunfire meant one of two things. Either someone had finished what they started, or they were waiting for a reason to fire again. His hands instinctively went to his coat pocket, feeling for the familiar weight of his old hunting knife. He didn't carry a rifle anymore, hadn't needed one in years, but some things never left a man. Another shot, closer. Shadow growled, low and steady. Elias exhaled through his nose. "All right, boy, let's see what kind of trouble's brewing." He moved off the porch, boots crunching against the frost-bitten ground, and Shadow followed without hesitation. The path through the trees was familiar, even in the fading light. He knew these woods better than he knew most things. The trees whispered as he moved, branches shifting in the cold wind, shadows stretching long across the earth. Elias moved with the quiet patience of a man who had spent a lifetime listening. Years ago he had tracked deer through these same woods, moving with the careful precision of a hunter. Now his steps were slower, not out of caution, but out of age. Shadow padded beside him, silent as a ghost, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Then a new sound, faint but unmistakable. A whimper. Elias stopped. Shadow did too, his ears tilting forward. The sound came again, pained, weak, not human. Elias narrowed his eyes, following the noise through the underbrush. He pushed aside a curtain of branches, stepping into a small clearing, and there, caught in the dim light of the setting sun, was a deer. It was down, its flank torn open by a bullet, breath coming in short, labored gasps. Blood pooled beneath its trembling body, dark against the frozen earth. Elias clenched his jaw. A gut shot, a bad one. Whoever had fired the shot had either been a lousy hunter or someone who didn't care enough to finish the job. Either way, they had left this creature to suffer. Shadow whined low in his throat, stepping closer. Elias ran a hand down his face, Margaret had always hated hunting. She had understood it, had respected the balance of it, but she had never accepted the cruelty of those who did it carelessly. And this was careless. Elias knelt beside the deer, placing a steady hand against its trembling body. Its eyes were wide, dark, wild with pain and fear. It was too far gone to save. He exhaled, his breath misting in the cold air. "Sorry, girl," he murmured. "This ain't the way it should have been." The knife at his hip was sharp, the blade worn from years of use. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. With practiced hands, he ended the suffering quickly. The forest exhaled around him. Shadow sat beside him, silent, watchful. The dog understood. Elias wiped the blade clean against his sleeve, his mind quiet. He had never taken life lightly. Even now, even after all these years, he still felt the weight of it. But then, another noise. Footsteps, not animal, not careful. Heavy boots against frozen leaves. Elias stood slowly, slipping the knife back into his belt. Shadow was already facing the sound, his body stiff, ready. A figure emerged from the trees. A man, rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes scanning the clearing. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick coat that did little to hide the arrogance in his stance. Elias didn't recognize him. The man's gaze landed on the deer, then flicked to Elias, suspicion creeping into his features. "You kill that?" Elias held his ground. "I finished what someone else started." The man scoffed. "That was my shot." Elias stared at him. "Then you're a piss-poor hunter." The man's eyes darkened. Shadow let out a low, warning growl. Elias didn't flinch. "You leave an animal to suffer like that. You don't deserve a rifle in your hands." The man took a step closer. "And who the hell are you to tell me that, old man?" Elias didn't move, didn't blink. "Just someone who's been in these woods longer than you've been alive." The man's grip tightened on his rifle strap. "You got a problem?" Shadow's growl deepened, his body lowering, coiled like a spring. Elias exhaled slowly. He wasn't looking for trouble, never had been, but he wasn't one to back down either. "You hunting out here alone?" Elias asked, his voice steady. The man hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. Elias caught it, the flicker of uncertainty, the way the man shifted his weight. He wasn't alone. There were more out here. Elias's pulse slowed. The woods had always been his home, but for the first time in years, he realized he wasn't as alone as he thought. And whoever these men were, they weren't here just to hunt. Shadow's stance hadn't changed. He was waiting for a command, waiting for Elias to decide what came next. Elias took a slow step back, hands loose at his sides. "You got what you came for," he said. "Now get." The man hesitated again, then huffed, shaking his head. "Crazy old bastard." He turned, disappearing back into the trees. Elias stayed still, listening, waiting. Then, distant voices, more than one, moving through the woods. Shadow stepped closer, pressing against Elias's leg. A silent warning. Elias exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, boy," he murmured. "I hear him too." He turned, heading back toward the cabin, Shadow close on his heels. Whatever was happening in these woods, it wasn't over yet. And for the first time in a long time, Elias felt something stir deep in his gut. A feeling he thought he'd left behind years ago. A reason to stand his ground. Elias moved quickly but without panic, his steps sure despite the stiffness in his joints. The years may have slowed him down, but his instincts were sharp as ever. Shadow stayed close, his breath steady, golden eyes flicking between Elias and the path ahead. The cabin came into view, its silhouette dark against the deepening twilight. Elias stepped onto the porch and turned, scanning the woods. The distant voices had faded, but that didn't mean they were gone. No, whoever those men were, they were still out there, and they weren't just careless hunters. Elias opened the cabin door and let Shadow inside first, then shut it behind them. He slid the latch into place, though he knew a simple lock wouldn't stop trouble, if it really wanted in. The fire in the hearth had burned low, the embers casting a soft, flickering glow over the room. Elias crossed to the small wooden cabinet against the wall. His fingers hesitated over the handle before pulling it open. Inside, wrapped in an old cloth, lay a shotgun. It had been years since he'd last held it. Years since he'd had a reason to. He ran a calloused hand over the worn stock. The weight of it in his grip was familiar, unsettling. He had promised himself he wouldn't need it again. Shadow sat near the door, his ears perked, listening. He was waiting. Elias had no doubt the dog had faced worse things than a few men with guns. Elias loaded the shotgun slowly, deliberately. "I don't go looking for fights," he muttered, more to himself than the dog. "But I don't run from 'em either." Shadow let out a quiet huff, almost like he understood. Elias settled into his old chair near the fire, the shotgun resting across his lap. He wouldn't go looking for them, but if they came back, he'd be ready. The minutes stretched. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, its voice sharp and lonesome. Then, footsteps. Elias stiffened, his fingers tightening around the shotgun. Shadow rose to his feet, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. The steps weren't rushed. They were careful, deliberate. Not someone lost. Someone looking. Elias exhaled through his nose. "Show yourself," he called, voice steady. Silence. Then, 3 knocks against the door. Not hurried, not frantic, just expectant. Elias's grip on the shotgun didn't loosen. "You lost?" A pause, then a voice, calm, almost friendly. "Not at all. Just wanted to have a little chat." Elias narrowed his eyes. "That's so?" "That's right," the voice continued. "My name's Connor. I think we might have gotten off on the wrong foot earlier." Elias didn't answer, didn't move. "I see you've got a fine dog there," Connor went on. "Looks like a working breed. Bet he's real good at what he does." Elias felt something cold settle in his gut. The way the man spoke, it wasn't idle talk, it was pointed. Shadow's growl deepened. "Why don't you step outside?" Connor suggested. "We can have ourselves a civil conversation." Elias let the silence stretch long enough to make a point. Then, finally, he spoke. "If you got something to say, say it." Connor chuckled. "I think you'd rather hear it in person." Elias shifted his grip on the shotgun. "Last chance," Connor said. "Come out, talk to me, or things get a little difficult." Elias felt his pulse slow. He had lived a long life, seen the good and bad in people, and he knew, without a doubt, that Connor wasn't alone out there. Whoever these men were, they weren't just careless hunters. They were here for a reason, and Elias had just become part of it. Elias exhaled slowly, his breath steady despite the tension crackling in the air. His mind moved through the possibilities, weighing each outcome. If he stepped outside, he'd be outnumbered. If he stayed put, they might force his hand. Shadow hadn't taken his eyes off the door. The dog wasn't just alert, he was waiting. He knew danger when he saw it. Elias made his decision. "You boys got the wrong man," he called. "Ain't nothing here for you." There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. "See, that's where you're wrong," Connor said. "We're looking for something, and I think you might just have it." Elias's grip tightened on the shotgun. "That dog of yours," Connor continued. "He's a special one, isn't he? Not just some stray." Elias went still. Shadow. It wasn't about him. It was about the dog. Connor took a step closer to the door. "Now, I know a thing or two about dogs like that. They don't just end up in the woods by accident, and I'm willing to bet he belongs to someone. Maybe even to me." Elias felt his jaw clench. "He's not yours." Another chuckle. "You sure about that?" "'Cause I got a different story." The implication was clear. They weren't here to hunt. They were tracking Shadow. Elias glanced at the dog. Shadow hadn't moved, but his entire body was rigid with awareness. Something had happened to him. Something bad. And these men were part of it. Elias shifted in his chair. "If that's true," he said, voice level, "then you won't mind telling me where he came from." A pause. Then, "How about we talk in person?" Elias let the silence hang between them. Then, deliberately, he reached up and unlatched the door. He didn't open it fully, just enough to step onto the porch, the shotgun held loosely at his side. Connor stood a few feet away, the dim light casting shadows across his face. He was younger than Elias had expected, maybe mid-30s, his features sharp, his expression unreadable. He carried himself like a man used to getting what he wanted. Two more figures lingered in the trees behind him, waiting, watching. "That's better," Connor said. "See? No reason to make this difficult." Elias didn't speak. Connor tilted his head. "That dog, he was part of something important. And you're standing in the way of getting him back." Elias exhaled through his nose. "You think that's how this works?" Connor's eyes flicked to the shotgun. "I think you're an old man sitting on borrowed time. And I think you're smart enough to know how this ends." Elias glanced at the trees, at the men lurking in the darkness. The weight of the shotgun was solid in his hands. He looked back at Connor, and then, very quietly, he smiled. "You boys have no idea who you're messing with," he said. Connor's smirk faltered. Inside the cabin, Shadow let out a low, guttural growl. And just like that, the standoff had begun. The night pressed in around them, thick and heavy like a storm waiting to break. Elias stood on the porch, shotgun steady in his hands, eyes locked on the man before him. Connor's smirk had faded, replaced with something colder, sharper. Behind him, the other men shifted in the darkness, their silhouettes barely visible against the trees. Inside the cabin, Shadow remained just behind the door, his growl a low vibration in the air. Elias exhaled through his nose. "You boys come all this way for a dog?" Connor tilted his head slightly as if amused by the question. "Not just any dog." His gaze flicked toward the door, toward the shadow of movement within. "That one belongs to someone very important, and they want him back." Elias said nothing, but his grip on the shotgun didn't waver. "You don't know what you've got, old man," Connor continued. "That shepherd? He's military grade, trained for things most men can't even stomach. Dogs like him?" He whistled low. "They don't just get lost, they escape." Elias felt the words settle in his chest. Escape. He looked at Shadow, at the worn body that still carried the weight of discipline, at the scars hidden beneath thick fur. This dog wasn't just abandoned. He had run. And now, they were here to take him back. Elias's jaw tightened. Connor sighed, shifting his weight. "Listen, I'm trying to be reasonable here. We could have come in guns blazing, but I thought I'd give you the chance to do the smart thing. Hand him over, and we walk away. No trouble." The night hummed with silence. Then Elias spoke, voice like gravel. "You think I scare easy, son?" Connor's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you're a tired old man playing hero for a mutt that doesn't belong to you." Elias gave a slow nod. "That's so?" His finger hovered near the trigger. He wasn't afraid to use it, but he knew the weight of pulling that trigger, knew the finality of it. He didn't want this to end in blood, but if it had to, he wouldn't hesitate. Connor must have seen something in his eyes because his smirk faltered again. His jaw tensed. "You're making a mistake," Connor muttered. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Elias took a step forward, just enough to make a point. "Son, I don't care who you work for. You put an animal through hell and expect me to hand him back over? Ain't gonna happen." The wind howled through the trees, whispering through the branches, rustling the dry leaves on the ground. Connor stared at him for a long moment. Then, finally, he exhaled. "All right," he muttered, taking a step back. "All right, old man." But Elias didn't relax. He knew that look, the way a man moved when he had already decided on something else. This wasn't over. Connor turned on his heel, stepping back into the darkness, his men following. Their movements were silent, swallowed by the night. Elias listened, waiting until the last trace of their presence disappeared into the forest. He didn't move until even the wind seemed to settle. Only then did he lower the shotgun. Inside the cabin, Shadow let out a long, slow breath. Elias turned, stepping inside. He latched the door behind him, then rested the shotgun against the wall. The fire in the hearth had burned low, flickering weakly against the old wooden walls. Shadow sat near the door, his gaze locked onto Elias, waiting. The old man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Well, boy," he muttered, "looks like we just made ourselves a whole mess of trouble." Shadow didn't move, didn't blink, and for the first time, Elias saw something in those golden eyes he hadn't noticed before. Not just fear, not just obedience, understanding. Shadow knew what was coming. And he wasn't running, neither was Elias. He sank into his old chair, listening to the night beyond the cabin walls. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was waiting. Something was coming. And when it did, Elias knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them take that dog. Not now. Not ever. The night stretched long and quiet, but Elias knew better than to trust the silence. He sat in his chair, hands folded over his lap, the fire's glow casting flickering shadows along the walls. The shotgun rested against the armrest, within reach. Shadow lay at his feet, his breathing steady but his ears twitching at every distant noise. The men would be back. Elias had seen their type before. Young, cocky, thinking the world bent to their will. Connor might have walked away, but men like him didn't take no for an answer. Outside, the wind had died down. The forest held its breath. Elias exhaled, rising slowly from his chair. His body ached from years of hard living, but his mind was clear. He moved to the cabinet, pulling open the small drawer beneath where the shotgun had rested. His fingers wrapped around the cold steel of an old revolver. It was a relic, something he had kept more for sentiment than need. But tonight, sentiment had nothing to do with it. He checked the chamber, 6 rounds, each one as old as the memories that came with them. Shadow lifted his head as Elias tucked the revolver into his belt. "You feel it too, huh?" Elias murmured. The dog didn't make a sound, but his golden eyes were locked on the door. A deep unease settled in Elias's chest. He had spent his life learning the ways of the wild, the patterns of men. Right now, everything in him said the same thing. They were already here. Then, like an answer to his thoughts, the first sound came, a twig snapping in the woods beyond the cabin. Not the wind, not an animal. Elias moved to the window, careful to stay out of the firelight's glow. He peered through the glass, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing. But he knew they were out there. Shadow let out a quiet growl, barely audible, but Elias felt the vibration of it through the floorboards. They were waiting. A smarter man might have packed his things and slipped into the night, but Elias had never been much for running. Not from men like these. Another sound. Footsteps. Light. Careful. They were circling. Elias reached for the shotgun, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness. His heart was steady, his breath even. A man who had spent his years expecting nothing from the world learned not to be surprised when trouble finally came knocking. And then, the door handle twisted. Slow. Testing. Elias didn't move, didn't speak. The handle stilled. A pause. Then, a single knock. Not rushed, not hesitant. Elias's jaw tightened. "You come to talk again?" he called out. Silence. Shadow stood now, his body stiff, head low. Elias moved to the door, shotgun still at his side. "You got one chance to walk away," he said, voice steady. "But you try to come through this door, and you won't like what's waiting for you." Another pause. Then, A laugh, low, cold. "Fair enough," Connor's voice came from the other side. "Was hoping you'd say that." Then, all at once, the quiet shattered. Glass exploded as a window blew inward, the rush of movement sudden and sharp. A figure dove through, landing hard, rolling to his feet. Elias raised the shotgun, but before he could fire, another crash, this time from the side window. They were coming in from all angles. Shadow sprang forward, teeth bared, his body a blur of motion as he lunged at the first man through the window. A sharp yell, the sound of fabric tearing, the gurgle of a struggle. Elias took 2 steps back, positioning himself with the door at his side. The first attacker barely had time to turn before Elias fired. The blast tore through the small cabin, the force of it sending the man stumbling back into the table, knocking over the oil lamp. Firelight flickered wildly as the room turned to chaos. Shadow tore into the second man, his growl a deep, guttural thing. The man screamed, his arms flailing as he tried to shake the dog off. Then, another figure at the door. Connor. He moved fast, faster than Elias expected, and before Elias could raise the shotgun, Connor struck. A hard shove, enough to throw Elias off balance. The shotgun clattered to the floor. Connor was on him in an instant, fists driving into his ribs, shoving him against the wall. The old wood groaned under the weight of their struggle. Elias gritted his teeth, twisting free just enough to throw a hard elbow into Connor's jaw. The younger man stumbled back, cursing. Elias reached for his belt, the revolver. Connor saw the movement and lunged, grabbing Elias's wrist, twisting it hard. The gun fell to the floor. Elias responded the only way he knew how, with pure, stubborn force. He slammed his forehead into Connor's nose, a crack, a curse. Blood splattered across the wooden floor. Connor stumbled back, clutching his face. Elias didn't hesitate. He dropped low, reaching for the revolver, but before he could grab it, a boot slammed into his side, sending him sprawling. One of the other men. Elias hit the floor hard, pain flaring through his ribs. Connor wiped the blood from his nose, exhaling sharply. "You should have just handed over the damn dog," he muttered. Elias coughed, pushing himself onto his elbows. "You should have learned some manners," Connor sneered. "I don't need manners." He nodded to the man standing over Elias. "Hold him." The man bent down, grabbing Elias's arms. A mistake. Because at that moment, a blur of fur and rage launched from across the cabin. Shadow hit the man like a hammer, teeth sinking deep into his arm. The man shrieked, stumbling back, flailing. And in the chaos, Elias reached for the revolver. He rolled onto his back, lifting the gun. Connor turned. Elias fired. The shot echoed through the cabin, deafening. Connor staggered, clutching his side, eyes wide. Blood bloomed against his coat. For a moment, he just stood there, stunned. Then he stumbled back toward the door, breath ragged. "Go!" he barked at the others. "We're done here!" The man Shadow had attacked shoved the dog off and scrambled toward the window. Connor gave Elias one last look, one filled with something between fury and grudging respect, before disappearing into the night. Elias didn't move, didn't lower the gun, not until the last sound of their retreat had faded into the forest. Then slowly, he exhaled. Shadow limped toward him, blood staining his fur, not his own. Elias ran a hand over his face. His ribs ached, his breathing sharp. The cabin was a wreck, glass, splintered wood, smoke from the overturned lamp. But they were alive, and the bastards were gone. For now. Elias looked down at Shadow, who stared back, his golden eyes steady. Elias let out a rough chuckle, shaking his head. "Hell of a mess we made, boy." Shadow huffed, then, just for a moment, his tail wagged. Elias sighed, leaning his head back against the wall. He had a feeling this wasn't over, not yet, but he'd be ready when it was. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, the faint embers of the overturned oil lamp casting eerie flickers along the walls. Elias forced himself upright, ribs protesting, breath coming in slow, measured gasps. Every inch of his body ached, but he ignored it. He had no time for pain. The cabin was a wreck. The table lay overturned, shards of broken glass glittering in the firelight. Blood streaked the wooden floorboards, some his, some theirs. The open window let in the cold bite of the night, carrying the lingering echoes of their retreat. Shadow stood at his side, breathing heavy, his coat streaked with crimson, but his stance remained firm, unwavering. Elias knew the dog wouldn't fall until the fight was done, and the fight wasn't over yet. Elias moved to the door, pressing his shoulder against the wooden frame as he peered into the darkness beyond. The forest stretched out before him, silent and waiting. He knew better than to assume they were gone for good. Connor was wounded, but he wasn't the kind of man to let a bullet in the side end things. And Elias had just sent a clear message. This wasn't their fight to win. He exhaled, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Damn fool," he muttered under his breath. He hadn't planned on taking on a bunch of trained men tonight, but fate had never given him much of a choice in anything. Shadow let out a low chuff, tail flicking once. Elias glanced down at him. "Yeah, boy, I know. Ain't no turning back now." He had to finish this. They wouldn't stop coming. Not now. Not after tonight. And that meant one thing. Elias had to take the fight to them. The hunt begins. Elias moved with purpose, strapping the revolver to his belt and slinging the shotgun over his shoulder. His steps were steady despite the throbbing in his ribs, his mind already calculating the next move. He couldn't wait for them to return. If he did, they'd come with more men, more guns, more trouble. No, he needed to end this on his own terms. He needed to find them before they found him again. Shadow followed without hesitation as Elias slipped into the trees, his footsteps quiet against the frozen ground. The night air was sharp, but the scent of blood and gunpowder still lingered. Elias had spent years tracking things through these woods. Deer, foxes, even the occasional trespasser. But tonight, he wasn't hunting animals. He was hunting men, and he knew exactly where to start. The ridge. It was the highest point in the area, the only real vantage spot overlooking the forest. If Connor and his men were regrouping, they'd go there, a place to see the land, to plan their next move. Elias moved fast, each step careful but certain. Shadow stayed close, his ears flicking at every shift in the underbrush. The night stretched on, thick with anticipation. Every sound felt magnified, every movement a potential threat. Then, voices. Faint, carried by the wind. Elias stopped, lowering himself into a crouch, pressing a hand to Shadow's back to still him. Ahead, barely visible through the dense trees, a fire flickered against the darkness. "Found you." Elias crept forward, slow and patient. He had no intention of charging in blind. He needed to know what he was walking into. As he neared the ridge, the firelight illuminated the scene. Connor sat on a fallen log, his coat stained with blood, his face twisted in frustration. Another man wrapped a makeshift bandage around his side, while two others stood near the fire, guns resting within reach. 4 men, 2 wounded. Elias's odds were getting better. He inhaled through his nose, steadying his grip on the shotgun. This was it. He could end this now. But just as he was about to move, Connor spoke. "This ain't over," he muttered, voice laced with anger. "We're coming back for that dog. You hear me?" Elias stilled, his blood turning cold. One of the men glanced over. "You sure it's worth it?" Connor's eyes darkened. "You have no idea who that dog belonged to." He exhaled sharply, wincing as pain flared through his side. "We bring him back and we walk away with more than just a paycheck. That shepherd is worth more than any of us put together." Elias's grip on the shotgun tightened. It had never just been about the dog. Shadow wasn't just a lost soldier. He was a prize, a piece of something bigger, something dangerous. And Elias wasn't about to let them have him. The final stand. Elias moved before they even knew he was there. The shotgun cracked through the night, the blast sending one of the men sprawling. Before the others could react, Elias was already shifting, already aiming again. Shadow launched forward, a blur of fur and fury, sinking his teeth into the nearest man's arm before he could reach his weapon. Chaos erupted. Connor shouted, scrambling to grab his gun, but Elias was faster. He turned, leveling the shotgun, his voice calm despite the storm around them. "Move, and you won't get back up." Connor froze. The fire crackled between them, illuminating the raw fury in the younger man's face. He wanted to fight. Elias could see it in the clench of his jaw, the way his fingers twitched toward his holster. But he wasn't stupid. Not anymore. "You're making a mistake," Connor hissed. Elias exhaled slowly. "Number you did, the second you came after this dog." Connor's nostrils flared. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Elias tilted his head slightly. "Then tell me." For a moment he thought Connor might. There was something behind his eyes, something almost like hesitation. But then he smirked. "You'll find out soon enough." Elias didn't like that answer. He stepped forward, pressing the barrel of the shotgun against Connor's chest. "You and your men disappear. You don't come back. You don't send anyone else. You understand me?" Connor held his gaze, his lips curling slightly. "And if I don't?" Elias didn't blink. "Then I finish what I started." A long pause. Then Connor laughed. A low, bitter sound. "You got guts, old man. I'll give you that." He glanced at his remaining men. One was still on the ground, groaning in pain. The other had managed to wrestle free from Shadow, but he wasn't making any sudden moves. They were beaten. For now. Connor exhaled sharply, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "All right," he muttered. "We're gone." Elias didn't lower the gun. Not yet. He waited, watching as Connor nodded to his men. Slowly, carefully, they backed away from the fire, retreating into the darkness beyond the ridge. Elias stayed still, his breath steady, his grip firm. Only when the last shadow disappeared into the trees did he finally lower the shotgun. The fire crackled softly, the only sound left in the empty clearing. Shadow stepped beside him, his golden eyes still locked on the path the men had taken. Elias reached down, scratching behind the dog's ear. "Reckon that's the last we'll see of him." Shadow let out a soft huff, as if he wasn't entirely convinced. Elias sighed, looking out into the darkened forest. Maybe Shadow was right. Maybe this wasn't over. But for now, it was enough. For now, they were free. And that was all that mattered. The fire had burned down to embers, the last traces of smoke curling lazily into the cold night air. The ridge was silent now, the men long gone, but Elias still stood there, his shotgun resting against his shoulder, his breath steady but slow. Shadow sat beside him, his golden eyes fixed on the dark path the men had taken, his body still coiled with tension. Even now, even with the immediate danger gone, neither of them could fully relax. Elias exhaled, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness in his bones. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "Let's go home." Shadow hesitated, his ears twitching as if listening for something neither of them could see. But after a moment, he let out a slow breath, nudging his nose against Elias's leg before falling into step beside him. The walk back to the cabin was slow, careful. The adrenaline that had carried Elias through the night was fading, replaced by the familiar weight of exhaustion. Every step sent a dull ache through his ribs, but he ignored it. Pain was temporary. He had survived worse. The real question now was what came next. Elias had lived his life by one simple rule: keep to yourself, and the world will leave you be. But that rule had been shattered the moment he found that rusted trap, the moment Shadow had stepped into his life. Now he was tangled in something bigger than himself, something dangerous. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure he could just walk away from it. A quiet morning. By the time they reached the cabin, The sky was beginning to lighten, soft streaks of gray and blue stretching across the horizon. Elias pushed open the door, stepping inside, his breath misting in the cool air. The place was a mess. The broken glass, the overturned furniture, the lingering scent of gunpowder and blood. Elias ran a hand over his face. "Hell of a night," he muttered. Shadow padded in behind him, moving carefully through the wreckage, his nose twitching as he took in the scents of battle. Elias knelt beside the fireplace, tossing a few fresh logs onto the embers. The flames crackled back to life, casting warm light across the cabin's scarred interior. He sat back against the wooden floor, stretching his legs out in front of him. Shadow settled beside him, his large frame warm against Elias's side. For a long while, they just sat there. No noise, no movement. Just the quiet understanding between two souls that had been through hell together. The weight of a name. Elias reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing against the old photograph. Margaret's smile looked back at him, warm and familiar. He sighed, rubbing his thumb along the worn edges. "Guess you were right, darlin'," he murmured. "Took me long enough to see it." Margaret had always believed in second chances, in redemption. Elias had spent years thinking his time for either had long passed. But now, sitting here, watching the firelight dance along the floorboards, he wasn't so sure. His gaze drifted to Shadow, who lay stretched out beside him, his breathing slow and even. The dog had fought for his life tonight, had bled for his freedom. And Elias had fought for him too. The thought settled deep in his chest, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. "Guess we gotta figure out what to do with you now," Elias muttered. Shadow cracked one eye open, letting out a soft huff. Elias smirked. Yeah, I know. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it." He leaned back against the fireplace, closing his eyes for just a moment. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself rest. A path forward. The morning passed in slow silence. Elias moved through the cabin, putting things back in order, sweeping up broken glass, straightening the overturned table. His ribs still ached, but the pain was manageable. Shadow stayed close, always watching, always listening. Elias knew the men wouldn't be back, not immediately. Connor had been too wounded, too shaken. But that didn't mean they were gone for good. No, something told Elias that this wasn't the end of it, that this was only the beginning. He stepped onto the porch, leaning against the railing as he watched the sun rise over the trees. The world looked the same as it had yesterday, but everything had changed. Elias wasn't a man who went looking for trouble. But now, trouble had found him, and he wasn't about to turn his back on it. Shadow stepped up beside him, his gaze steady, waiting. Elias looked down at the dog, then let out a slow breath. "Reckon we got some decisions to make, boy," he muttered. Shadow didn't move, didn't blink, and Elias knew deep down that whatever came next, they would face it together. Some bonds are forged in fire, in the quiet moments after the storm, in the understanding between two lost souls who find purpose in each other. Elias never expected to fight for anything again, but sometimes life has other plans. Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was a survivor, a soldier, and now a friend. Their story isn't over, it's only just begun. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Have you ever met an animal that changed your life? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because some stories deserve to be told.